Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the remarkable, complex, and surprisingly empowered lives of Viking women, the fierce, intelligent, and independent figures who shaped the Norse world in ways that would shock most people today. From legal rights that wouldn't be seen in other parts of Europe for centuries to spiritual power that commanded respect from warriors and kings alike, their story is one of strength, agency, and influence that Hollywood got completely wrong. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Viking women, you might picture silent, submissive figures, cowering in smoky longhouses, while their husbands sailed off to raid distant shores. Perhaps you imagine them as nothing more than servants, property, or prizes to be won in battle-pale shadows, living at the mercy of brutal, bearded warriors. But that image, painted by centuries of male historians and Hollywood fantasies, couldn't be further from the truth. Viking women weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. They were landowners, business leaders, priestesses, and decision-makers who wielded power in ways that would make medieval European queens envious. They could divorce their husbands, inherit vast fortunes, demand justice in courts of law, and command households that stretched across continents. Some even picked up swords and shields, earning their place in the sagas alongside the most legendary warriors. The real story of Viking women isn't about oppression, it's about a society that, for all its brutality, offered women freedoms that were almost unthinkable in the rest of the medieval world. If you think managing a modern household is exhausting, imagine being responsible for a Viking longhouse in the dead of winter, a smoky, sprawling wooden fortress packed with anywhere from 20 to 100 people, all of whom expect to be fed, clothed, and kept alive until spring. Now imagine that half your husband's relatives hate you, the servants might revolt if the ale runs out, and the livestock outnumber the humans by a comfortable margin. Oh, and your husband? He's somewhere across the North Sea, probably getting himself killed for a handful of silver coins and the dubious honor of dying with a sword in his hand. Congratulations, you're now the undisputed ruler of what amounts to a medieval apartment complex crossed with a farm, a brewery, a textile factory, and a small military installation. Welcome to the life of a Viking woman, where domestic goddess wasn't just a compliment, it was a job description that could determine whether your entire community lived or died. The longhouse wasn't just a home, it was the beating heart of Viking society, and the woman who controlled it wielded power that would make a medieval European queen weep with envy. While her contemporaries in England or France were busy being decorative and obedient, the Viking matriarch was making decisions that could bankrupt kingdoms or secure dynasties. She held the keys literally and figuratively to everything that mattered: the food stores, the treasure chests, the servants' quarters, and the all-important brewing vats. Those keys, dangling from an elaborate chain at her belt, weren't just tools. They were symbols of absolute domestic authority that commanded respect from warriors who had stared down berserkers and lived to tell about it. Picture the scene: a longhouse stretching nearly 300 feet in length, its timber walls rising like the ribs of some massive beached whale. Inside, the central hearth crackles and smokes, casting flickering shadows across carved wooden posts that tell stories of gods and heroes. Along the walls, raised platforms serve as beds, storage areas, and private spaces for the dozen or more families who call this place home. Cattle, sheep, and horses occupy one end of the building because nothing says cozy family gathering like sharing your living space with livestock, while the main hall buzzes with the constant activity of cooking, weaving, storytelling, and the occasional violent argument over whose turn it is to muck out the animal stalls. At the center of this organized chaos stands the lady of the house, the husfreyja, whose title literally means lady of the house, but carries weight that translates more accurately to the person who keeps everyone from starving, freezing, or murdering each other. She's not just the woman of the house, she's the CEO, CFO, and Chief Operating Officer of a complex economic and social enterprise that would challenge a modern business school graduate. Every morning, she rises before dawn to survey her domain, checking on sick animals, inspecting food stores, settling disputes between servants, and planning the day's activities with the precision of a military strategist. Because in the harsh world of medieval Scandinavia, poor planning didn't just mean disappointed guests, it meant dead families. The servants and slaves under her command weren't just a handful of kitchen maids and stable boys. They were entire workforces that could number in the dozens. Thrall slaves captured in raids or born into bondage performed the heaviest labor, while freed servants and hired workers handled specialized tasks. Managing this diverse group required diplomatic skills that would challenge a United Nations ambassador. The Husfreyja had to balance the competing interests of free servants who could quit and find work elsewhere, thralls who might escape or rebel if treated too harshly, and family members who thought their status entitled them to lighter duties. She allocated tasks, settled workplace disputes, and maintained the delicate social hierarchy that kept the household functioning. A servant who felt unfairly treated might sabotage the brewing process or accidentally let the sheep wander off. A thrall pushed too hard might poison the porridge or set fire to the grain stores. The lady of the house walked a tightrope between authority and diplomacy, knowing that a single misstep could turn her orderly domain into a chaotic nightmare. Food production and preservation consumed much of the Husfreyja's attention, and with good reason. In a world without refrigeration, canned goods, or grocery stores, keeping people fed year-round required planning that would impress a modern supply chain manager. She oversaw the slaughter and preservation of livestock, timing these operations with the seasons to ensure fresh meat in autumn and preserved provisions through the winter months. Smoking, salting, and drying techniques turned temporary abundance into long-term survival. She managed the production of Skyra protein-rich dairy product that could sustain families through lean times and supervised the brewing of ale, which wasn't just a recreational beverage, but a crucial source of calories and nutrients. The brewing process alone was an art form that required knowledge of malting, fermentation, and quality control. A batch of ale gone wrong could mean not just disappointed guests, but genuine nutritional crisis for the household. The Husfreyja's agricultural responsibilities extended far beyond the longhouse walls. She coordinated the seasonal rhythms of planting, harvesting, and livestock management that determined whether the community would feast or starve. In spring, she organized the sowing of barley, oats, and vegetables, allocating labor and resources with the precision of a chess master. Summer brought haymaking, a frantic race against weather, and time that required every available hand. The quality and quantity of hay harvested would determine how many animals could survive the winter, which in turn affected everything from meat supplies to milk production to the availability of leather and wool. A miscalculation here could doom the entire community to a winter of hunger. Autumn was perhaps the most critical season, when the Husfreyja's skills as a planner and organizer were tested to their limits. This was slaughter time, when decisions made in the space of a few weeks would determine the household's fate for the next 6 months. Too many animals killed meant abundant meat in the short term, but no breeding stock for next year. Too few meant insufficient protein to sustain the community through winter. She had to calculate feed requirements, assess the health and breeding potential of each animal, and coordinate with neighboring households to ensure optimal genetic diversity in the breeding stock. These weren't simple farm decisions. They were complex economic calculations that required understanding of animal husbandry, nutrition, market conditions, and long-term planning. The textile production under her supervision was equally demanding and far more complex than modern people might imagine. The husfreyja oversaw every stage of the process, from shearing sheep and harvesting flax to spinning thread, dyeing fabric, and weaving the intricate patterns that marked Norse textiles as luxury goods throughout medieval Europe. This wasn't just about keeping the family clothed. Viking textiles were valuable trade commodities that could purchase everything from silver jewelry to exotic spices. A skilled household could produce fabrics fine enough to adorn kings or sturdy enough to outfit merchant expeditions. The husfreyja managed teams of women who specialized in different aspects of production, coordinated the timing of various processes, and maintained quality standards that could make or break trade relationships. The economic decision-making power wielded by Viking women would shock most people familiar with medieval European history. While their contemporaries in other parts of Europe were legally considered property of their fathers or husbands, Viking women controlled substantial wealth and made independent financial decisions. The husfreyja managed household budgets that included not just daily expenses, but major investments, purchasing new livestock, funding trading expeditions, hiring skilled craftsmen, and negotiating marriage alliances that could involve substantial dowries. She maintained relationships with merchants, monitored market conditions, and made strategic decisions about when to sell surplus goods and when to hold them for better prices. These women understood credit, debt, and investment in ways that would be familiar to modern business owners. They extended credit to customers, collected debts, and managed cash flow through seasonal variations in income and expenses. A husfreyja might loan grain to a neighboring household during a difficult spring, expecting repayment with interest after harvest. She might invest in a trading expedition, providing goods or silver in exchange for a share of the profits. These financial arrangements required sophisticated understanding of risk assessment, contract negotiation, and relationship management. A reputation for fair dealing could establish trade relationships that lasted generations. A reputation for sharp practice could isolate a household from the economic networks that made survival possible. The seasonal rhythm of Viking life placed enormous pressure on the husfreyja's organizational skills. Each season brought its own urgent priorities and deadline-driven activities. Spring meant preparing for planting while managing dwindling winter stores and dealing with animals weakened by months of limited feed. Summer required coordinating multiple agricultural activities while maintaining the household's daily operations. Autumn brought the frantic pace of harvest and preservation while preparing for winter's isolation. Winter meant maintaining morale and managing resources through months of darkness and confinement while planning for the next year's activities. The psychological demands of this role were immense. The husfreyja carried responsibility not just for her immediate family, but for entire extended networks of relatives, servants, and dependents. A single poor decision could mean starvation for dozens of people. A moment of inattention could result in spoiled food stores, escaped livestock, or fires that could destroy years of accumulated wealth. The weight of constant responsibility, combined with the physical demands of overseeing manual labor and the mental strain of complex decision-making, created pressures that would challenge even the most capable, modern executive. Yet these women weren't just surviving, they were thriving and innovating. Archaeological evidence reveals Viking households that achieved remarkable efficiency and prosperity under female management. Surplus production funded artistic endeavors, supported scholarship, and enabled the exploration and colonization efforts that carried Norse influence across the known world. The economic foundation that made Viking expansion possible was built and maintained by women who never left their home communities, but whose skills and decisions shaped the course of European history. The social dynamics within the Longhouse added another layer of complexity to the husfreyja's role. She had to manage relationships between multiple generations, navigate the competing interests of blood relatives and in-laws, and maintain harmony among people who had no choice but to live in close proximity through the long winter months. Personality conflicts, romantic entanglements, and family feuds could explode into violence that threatened the entire community. The husfreyja served as diplomat, mediator, and judge, settling disputes with wisdom and authority that maintained peace without undermining her own position. Her authority extended beyond the household to the broader community. Neighboring households looked to successful husfreyjor for advice on everything from agricultural techniques to child-rearing practices. These women formed networks of mutual support and information sharing that spanned entire regions. A husfreyja, known for her skill in brewing, might share her techniques with others in exchange for expertise in textile production or animal husbandry. These informal networks created resilience in communities that faced constant threats from weather, warfare, and economic disruption. The legal aspects of the husfreyja's role were equally impressive. She had the authority to enter into contracts, own property, and represent her household in legal proceedings. This wasn't just theoretical. Legal documents and saga accounts describe women making major land purchases, negotiating complex trade agreements, and pursuing legal remedies for wrongs committed against their households. They could sue for damages, collect debts, and even initiate blood feuds when legal remedies proved insufficient. This legal authority was backed by real power, economic resources, social networks, and the respect of communities that recognized their competence and judgment. The physical demands of the husfreyja's life were relentless. She rose before dawn and worked until long after sunset, moving constantly through the longhouse to supervise activities, inspect work, and solve problems. The work wasn't just supervisory. She often labored alongside her servants and thralls, demonstrating techniques, maintaining quality standards, and showing that she understood every aspect of the household's operations. Her hands were calloused from spinning, her back ached from bending over looms, and her clothes carried the constant aroma of smoke, animals, and hard work. The intellectual requirements of her position were equally demanding. The husfreyja needed detailed knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, food preservation, textile production, brewing, medicine, law, accounting, and human psychology. She had to understand weather patterns, market cycles, seasonal rhythms, and the complex web of social relationships that held Norse society together. This knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was practical expertise gained through years of experience and constant learning. A mistake in any area could have catastrophic consequences for everyone under her care. The emotional labor involved in managing a Viking household defies easy description. The husfreyja was expected to maintain morale during the darkest months of winter, comfort the grieving, celebrate achievements, and project confidence even when facing crisis. She mediated family disputes, counseled troubled servants, and provided leadership during emergencies. When storms threatened buildings, when disease struck livestock, or when raiders appeared on the horizon, people looked to her for guidance and reassurance. The psychological pressure of being the emotional anchor for dozens of people, while managing her own fears and uncertainties, required strength that went far beyond physical endurance. Training for this role began in childhood and continued throughout a woman's life. Young girls learned by observation and participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. By adolescence, they were managing significant aspects of household operations. Marriage brought new challenges as they adapted their skills to different households, established authority over unfamiliar servants, and learned to work with new resources and constraints. The learning never stopped. Experienced husfreyja constantly refined their techniques, adapted to changing circumstances, and passed their knowledge to the next generation. The tools of the husfreyja's trade were as varied as her responsibilities. Her key ring was the most visible symbol of her authority, but she also wielded account books, measuring devices, quality testing equipment, and specialized tools for every aspect of household production. Her knowledge was her most valuable tool, accumulated wisdom about techniques, relationships, timing, and judgment that couldn't be purchased or stolen. This expertise made her valuable not just to her own household, but to the entire community, creating respect and influence that extended far beyond domestic spheres. The seasonal festivals and rituals that punctuated the Viking year added another dimension to the husfreyja's responsibilities. She organized celebrations that maintained community bonds, supervised religious observances that ensured divine favor, and managed hospitality that demonstrated her household's prosperity and generosity. These events required months of planning, substantial resources, and flawless execution. A poorly managed festival could damage the household's reputation and undermine important social relationships. Success brought prestige that enhanced the family's position and opened doors to new opportunities. When you strip away the romantic mythology and Hollywood fantasies about Viking life, what emerges is a picture of women wielding power that their contemporaries, in supposedly more civilized parts of Europe, could barely imagine. The husfreyja wasn't just keeping house. She was running a complex economic enterprise that combined agriculture, manufacturing, trade, and human resource management in ways that required skills any modern CEO would recognize. She did this without the benefit of modern technology, communication systems, or financial instruments, relying instead on intelligence, experience, and sheer determination to succeed in a world where failure meant death. The next time you feel overwhelmed managing a modern household with its dishwashers, grocery stores, and central heating spare, a thought for the Viking woman who rose before dawn to check on her pregnant sow, spent the morning settling a dispute between her thralls, dedicated her afternoon to supervising the brewing of next winter's ale, and ended her day planning the strategic implications of her daughter's marriage alliance. She did all this while knowing that her husband might never return from his latest adventure, that the next winter could bring starvation if she miscalculated the harvest, and that her decisions would determine not just her own fate, but the survival of everyone who depended on her wisdom, her strength, and her absolutely unshakable determination to keep the longhouse fires burning, no matter what storms raged beyond its walls. Imagine walking into a medieval European courtroom as a woman and demanding justice for a crime committed against you. Now imagine the judge's reaction when you announce that you're representing yourself, that you own the land in dispute, and that if the court doesn't satisfy your demands for compensation, you'll be initiating divorce proceedings against your husband for failing to support your case adequately. In most of medieval Europe, this scenario would have ended with you being dragged away for witchcraft, madness, or the far more serious crime of forgetting your place in the natural order. But in Viking society, it was Tuesday. While women across the rest of Europe were busy being legally invisible, existing somewhere between livestock and furniture, in the eyes of the law, Viking women were striding into assemblies, demanding their rights, and occasionally terrifying grown men with their thorough understanding of legal precedent and their complete unwillingness to accept anything less than full justice. The legal landscape of medieval Europe was not, shall we say, friendly to women. In England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, women operated under the delightful legal principle of coverture, which held that a married woman was so thoroughly absorbed into her husband's legal identity that she ceased to exist as a separate person in the eyes of the law. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't appear in court, and couldn't even commit crimes because legally she wasn't there. An unmarried woman fared slightly better, existing in a legal limbo where she could own property until marriage instantly transferred everything to her husband, along with any hope of legal independence. It was a system designed by men, for men, with women serving as valuable but ultimately disposable accessories to the serious business of male legal and economic activity. But sail north to the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, and you'd find a legal system that would have left continental European lawyers speechless with shock. Viking women didn't just participate in legal proceedings, they dominated them with a confidence and competence that suggested they'd never received the memo about their supposed inferiority. They owned land, managed businesses, initiated lawsuits, demanded compensation, and negotiated settlements with the casual authority of people who had never doubted their right to do so. The thing system the assemblies where free men gathered to hear cases, and dispense justice welcomed women not as silent spectators, but as active participants whose voices carried weight and whose decisions commanded respect. The foundation of this legal equality rested on property rights that would have seemed revolutionary to women living under other legal systems. Viking women could own land outright, not as temporary caretakers or silent partners, but as absolute proprietors, with full rights to buy, sell, lease, and bequeath their holdings. These weren't small garden plots or token inheritances. They owned farms, trading establishments, workshops, and entire estates that generated substantial wealth and political influence. A woman might inherit her father's lands, purchase additional properties with her own earnings, and pass the entire accumulated wealth to her children without any male relative having the right to interfere or claim a share. This property ownership wasn't just theoretical. Archaeological evidence and documentary sources reveal women controlling vast agricultural estates, urban properties, and commercial enterprises throughout the Viking world. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries from Viking Age Norway, almost certainly belonged to a woman of immense wealth and power. Possibly Queen Åsa of Agderhu was buried with a ship, servants, horses, and grave goods that represented a fortune by any standard. But she wasn't unique. Lesser burials across Scandinavia reveal women buried with keys, weighing scales, and other symbols of economic authority that tell the same story. These were property owners and business managers whose wealth and status derived from their own achievements, not their relationships to men. The legal mechanisms that protected these property rights were sophisticated and comprehensive. Viking law codes, preserved in later Icelandic manuscripts, but reflecting much older traditions, spell out detailed procedures for property transfers, inheritance disputes, and commercial transactions that treated women as fully competent legal actors. Women could witness contracts, serve as sureties for loans, and enter into complex business partnerships. They could pursue legal remedies for breach of contract, demand compensation for property damage, and initiate proceedings to recover debts. The law didn't just permit these activities. It provided detailed frameworks for ensuring that women's economic interests were protected with the same vigor accorded to men. The inheritance laws of Viking society were particularly remarkable when compared to contemporary European practices. While most of medieval Europe operated under systems that heavily favored male heirs, Viking inheritance law recognized both sons and daughters as legitimate heirs with clearly defined rights to family property. A daughter could inherit her father's entire estate if there were no male heirs, but even when brothers existed, she was entitled to a substantial portion of the family wealth. These inheritance rights weren't subject to male approval or guardianship. They were absolute entitlements that could be claimed and defended in court. But perhaps most shocking to European sensibilities was the Viking woman's right to initiate divorce. In a continent where marriage was considered an indissoluble sacrament that bound women to their husbands, regardless of abuse, neglect, or incompatibility, Viking women could dissolve their marriages for a variety of reasons and walk away with their property, their children, and their dignity intact. The grounds for divorce were refreshingly practical: persistent failure to provide adequate financial support, physical abuse, public humiliation, sexual incompetence, and the wonderfully vague but apparently legally sufficient charge of general incompatibility. If your husband couldn't perform his basic marital duties, which included not just fidelity and support, but also maintaining the family's social standing and contributing to household prosperity, you could divorce him faster than he could say, "But honey." The divorce process itself was elegantly simple, requiring no ecclesiastical courts, no papal dispensations, and no groveling before male authorities who might or might not grant permission based on their assessment of your worthiness. A Viking woman seeking divorce simply declared her intentions before witnesses, specified her grounds, and initiated property division proceedings. The community's role was to ensure fair distribution of assets and custody arrangements, not to question whether divorce was morally permissible or whether the woman had sufficient cause. It was divorce by declaration, backed by legal frameworks that protected both parties' rights and interests. The property implications of divorce were particularly favorable to women. Unlike European systems where divorced women often found themselves destitute and socially ostracized, Viking divorce law ensured that women retained substantial assets and economic independence. A divorced woman kept her personal property, her share of jointly acquired assets, and often received ongoing support from her ex-husband's family. She could remarry without losing her accumulated wealth, or she could choose to remain single and manage her own affairs. The social stigma attached to divorce was minimal. Divorced women weren't social pariahs, but were often considered experienced and desirable marriage partners who had proven their ability to manage household affairs and defend their interests. The legal system's treatment of crimes against women reveals another dimension of Viking women's elevated status. While European legal codes often treated violence against women as property crimes against their male relatives, Viking law recognized women as individuals with inherent rights to personal safety and dignity. A woman who suffered assault, rape, or other violence could demand compensation directly, pursue legal remedies in her own name, and expect the community's support in obtaining justice. The compensation schedules detailed lists of payments owed for various injurious-treated crimes against women seriously, with substantial penalties that reflected their status as valued members of society. The concept of personal honor, so central to Viking culture, extended fully to women. An insult to a woman's reputation, an attack on her character, or an attempt to diminish her social standing was considered as serious as similar offenses against men. Women could demand satisfaction for slights, pursue legal remedies for defamation, and expect their male relatives to support their quests for justice. But they weren't dependent on male relatives to defend their honor. They could and did pursue these matters independently, using the legal system to protect their reputations and social positions. The Thing assemblies themselves were remarkable institutions that functioned as combination courts, legislative bodies, and social gatherings, where the community's free members gathered to resolve disputes and make collective decisions. Women participated in these assemblies, not as silent observers, but as active voices in community governance. They could present cases, offer testimony, propose solutions, and vote on community matters. Their participation wasn't token or ceremonial. Archaeological evidence suggests that some assemblies were actually dominated by women, particularly in matters relating to property disputes, family law, and commercial conflicts. The legal representation available to Viking women was sophisticated and professional. While women could and often did represent themselves in legal proceedings, they could also hire skilled advocates who specialized in legal argumentation and procedural expertise. These legal professionals, known as lagsugumen, or law speakers, were respected figures whose knowledge of precedent and skill in argumentation could determine the outcome of complex cases. Women employed these advocates not because they were legally incompetent, but because they recognized the value of professional expertise in navigating complex legal disputes. The evidentiary standards applied in cases involving women were rigorous and fair. Viking legal procedure emphasized testimony from credible witnesses, physical evidence, and logical argumentation, rather than trial by ordeal or other arbitrary methods. Women's testimony was considered equally valid with men's, and their word carried weight in determining the facts of cases. This wasn't just theoretical equality. Court records and saga accounts describe women providing crucial testimony that determined the outcomes of major legal disputes, including cases involving property worth fortunes and conflicts that could spark blood feuds. The international scope of Viking legal practice extended these protections across vast distances. Viking traders, raiders, and settlers carried their legal traditions throughout their far-flung territories, creating legal frameworks that protected women's rights from Iceland to Constantinople. A Viking woman living in Dublin, York, or Kiev could expect her property rights to be recognized, her legal standing to be respected, and her ability to seek justice to be supported by legal structures that transcended national boundaries. This legal portability was crucial for a society whose members regularly traveled vast distances for trade, exploration, and settlement. The economic implications of women's legal equality were profound and far-reaching. When women could own property, enter contracts, and pursue legal remedies, they became significant economic actors whose decisions shaped markets, trade relationships, and investment patterns. Viking women's economic activities weren't confined to domestic production. They invested in trading expeditions, financed exploration ventures, and participated in the complex web of credit and debt that sustained Viking commercial expansion. Their legal rights made these economic activities possible and profitable, creating wealth that funded the exploration and colonization efforts that carried Viking influence across the known world. The social implications were equally significant. Legal equality created social structures that were fundamentally different from those found elsewhere in medieval Europe. Viking women weren't passive recipients of male protection. They were active agents who shaped their own destinies and influenced the broader community's development. This agency created social dynamics that were more egalitarian, more flexible, and ultimately more resilient than systems based on rigid gender hierarchies. When women could make independent decisions about marriage, property, and legal matters, families and communities adapted to accommodate diverse arrangements and changing circumstances. The religious dimensions of Viking women's legal status reflected the broader spiritual equality that characterized Norse paganism. Unlike Christianity, which emphasized women's inherent sinfulness and subordination, Norse religion recognized female deities as powerful, independent figures who commanded respect and wielded authority. This religious framework supported legal structures that treated women as capable, responsible individuals, rather than as inherently flawed beings who required male guidance and protection. The goddesses Frigg and Freya weren't meek, subordinated figures. They were powerful, sometimes terrifying deities whose authority extended over crucial aspects of life and death. The documentary evidence for Viking women's legal rights comes from multiple sources that cross-reference and confirm each other's accounts. The Icelandic sagas, despite their literary embellishments, preserve detailed accounts of legal proceedings that reveal women's active participation in the judicial system. Law codes like Gragas, the medieval Icelandic legal compilation, provide specific procedures for women's legal activities. Archaeological evidence, including runic inscriptions and grave goods, confirms women's economic and social status. Foreign observers, from Byzantine chroniclers to English monks, commented on the unusual freedom and authority exercised by Viking women. The contrast with contemporary European legal systems couldn't be more stark. While English law was developing the doctrine that husband and wife were one person and that person was the husband, Viking law treated marriage as a partnership between legally equal individuals. While continental European legal codes were refining systems of male guardianship that treated women as perpetual minors, Viking law assumed women's competence and protected their independence. While church law across Europe was elaborating theological justifications for women's subordination, Viking legal tradition simply ignored gender as a relevant factor in determining legal capacity. The practical implementation of these legal rights required social structures that supported women's independence and agency. Viking society developed networks of female solidarity and mutual support that enabled women to pursue legal remedies and defend their rights effectively. Women shared legal knowledge, provided financial support for expensive legal proceedings, and offered testimony and advocacy when their friends and relatives faced legal challenges. These networks created informal but powerful systems of protection and empowerment that complemented the formal legal structures. The training and education that prepared Viking women for legal participation began early and continued throughout their lives. Young girls learned about property management, contract negotiation, and legal procedures by observing and gradually participating in household and community affairs. The oral tradition that preserved legal knowledge was accessible to women who memorized precedents, procedures, and arguments with the same diligence as men. This education created a population of legally literate women who understood their rights and possessed the knowledge necessary to defend them effectively. The legacy of Viking women's legal equality extended far beyond the medieval period. The legal traditions established in Viking settlements influenced the development of law in Iceland, England, Ireland, and other regions where Vikings settled. Some historians argue that Viking legal concepts contributed to the development of common law traditions that eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The principle that individuals, regardless of gender, possess inherent rights that must be protected by law can be traced back through various legal traditions to the Thing assemblies, where Viking women stood as equals before the law. If you think modern divorce proceedings are complicated, imagine explaining to a medieval European husband that his wife was leaving him because he failed to adequately support her lawsuit against the neighbor who insulted her at the last community assembly. Then imagine explaining that she was taking half the property, both children and the trading ship, and that if he objected, she'd see him in court where she'd represent herself. Thank you very much. It was a legal reality so far ahead of its time that the rest of Europe wouldn't catch up for nearly 1,000 years. And even then, with considerable reluctance and extensive legal maneuvering, designed to preserve as much male privilege as possible, while grudgingly acknowledging women's basic human rights. The Thing assemblies where these legal dramas played out weren't just courts. They were theatres of human drama, where property disputes became family feuds, commercial conflicts escalated into blood oaths, and divorce proceedings occasionally ended with the ex-husband offering to duel anyone who questioned his former wife's honor. Because apparently, even when your marriage failed spectacularly, there were still standards to maintain and reputations to protect. It was a legal system that combined practical problem-solving with soap opera-level emotional intensity, administered by people who understood that law wasn't just about rules and procedures. It was about maintaining the social fabric that held communities together when everything else threatened to tear them apart. Picture this. You're a medieval European king dealing with a particularly thorny political problem. You want divine guidance, so you consult your local priest, who consults his bishop, who writes to Rome, where a committee of elderly celibate men in elaborate hats debate theological implications for 6 months before sending back a carefully worded response that basically says, pray harder and donate more money. Now imagine, instead, that you could simply summon a woman who would go into a trance, commune directly with the gods, and tell you exactly what would happen if you invaded Denmark next Tuesday, including specific details about weather conditions, enemy troop movements, and whether your third cousin would survive the battle. In most of medieval Europe, such a woman would be burned as a witch faster than you could say heresy. But in Viking society, she was the Velva, and kings paid her in gold for the privilege of hearing prophecies that could reshape the fate of nations. While Christian Europe was busy explaining why women were inherently too spiritually inferior to approach the divine being, as medieval theologians helpfully noted, more susceptible to Satan's influence due to their descent from Viking society, was elevating women to the highest levels of spiritual authority. The Velva, or seeress, occupied a position in Norse religion that had no equivalent anywhere else in medieval Europe. She was prophet, priest, and spiritual authority rolled into one formidable package, wielding power that derived directly from the gods themselves, and commanding respect that transcended social rank, political affiliation, and even the basic survival instincts of men who had faced down berserkers in battle. The Velva was immediately recognizable by her distinctive costume and tools of the trade. She wore a blue or black cloak fastened with ornate brooches, a hood lined with white cat fur because apparently the gods had opinions about fashion, and carried a staff topped with a knob of bronze or iron, often decorated with intricate metalwork, that marked her as a person of considerable importance. Her belt held a collection of amulets, small tools, and pouches containing the various herbs, stones, and mysterious substances required for her magical practices. She was dressed, essentially, like someone who took her job seriously and wanted everyone else to take it seriously too. But the Velva's authority didn't derive from her impressive wardrobe. It came from her mastery of cider, the complex magical and divinatory tradition that was predominantly, though not exclusively, practiced by women. Cider was a sophisticated system of magic that encompassed prophecy, healing, shape-shifting, weather control, and the ability to influence the fates of individuals and entire communities. It was magic with practical applications, finding lost objects, healing diseases, ensuring good harvests, protecting travelers, and cursing enemies. In a world without modern medicine, weather forecasting, or GPS, the Velva's abilities weren't just impressive, they were essential survival tools that communities depended on for their continued existence. The practice of cider required extensive training, years of study, and what modern people might call a natural talent for altered states of consciousness. The Velva learned to enter deep trances during which she could communicate with spirits, see into the future, and access knowledge that was hidden from ordinary mortals. These trances weren't gentle, meditative states. They were dramatic, sometimes violent experiences that involved chanting, rhythmic movement, and what observers described as fits or seizures that left the Velva exhausted but filled with divine knowledge. It was spirituality as extreme sport, requiring physical stamina, mental discipline, and nerves of steel. The traveling Velva was a fixture of Viking society, moving from community to community according to seasonal patterns and the urgent needs of her clients. She arrived like a combination of traveling circus and emergency services, bringing entertainment, spiritual guidance, and practical solutions to problems that had been plaguing communities for months. Her arrival was an event that drew people from miles around, eager to consult her about everything from romantic troubles to military strategy. She might spend days or weeks in a single location, conducting private consultations, performing public ceremonies, and teaching young women who showed potential for cider practice. The Velva's services were expensive, reflecting both her skill and the dangerous nature of her work. Clients paid her in silver, gold, fine fabrics, and valuable goods, making successful Velvas wealthy women who could afford to travel in comfort and maintain the elaborate costumes and tools their profession required. But the high fees weren't just about greed. Cider practice was genuinely risky work that could result in spiritual attack, physical exhaustion, and social backlash if prophecies proved inconveniently accurate, or if clients decided to blame the messenger for unwelcome news. The political influence wielded by Velvas was extraordinary by medieval standards. Kings and jarls consulted them before major decisions, seeking not just general guidance, but specific tactical advice about timing, strategy, and potential outcomes. The sagas preserve accounts of Velvas who correctly predicted the results of battles, warned rulers about assassination attempts, and provided strategic intelligence that proved crucial to military success. Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, reportedly consulted Velvas regularly and credited them with helping him achieve his unification of the country. When your royal advisors included women who claimed direct communication with Odin, it tended to give their opinions considerable weight in policy discussions. The religious ceremonies conducted by Velvas were elaborate affairs that combined theatre, spirituality, and community bonding in ways that medieval Christianity simply couldn't match. A typical cider session might begin with the construction of a special platform or high seat where the Velva would conduct her ritual. The community would gather around her as she entered her trance, supported by assistants who chanted, played music, and maintained the sacred space during her spirit journey. The Velva would describe her visions as they occurred, narrating conversations with gods and spirits, while her audience listened in fascination and terror. These ceremonies weren't just religious observances, they were psychological events that processed community anxieties, provided emotional catharsis, and reinforced social bonds through shared spiritual experience. When the Velva announced that the gods were pleased with the community's offerings, people felt reassured and confident. When she warned of coming difficulties, the community could prepare mentally and practically for challenges ahead. When she cursed enemies or blessed endeavors, she was providing psychological advantages that could prove decisive in competitive or dangerous situations. The tools of the Velva's trade were as carefully crafted and symbolically rich as those of any medieval professional. Her staff was both practical walking stick and magical implement, often passed down through generations of practitioners and imbued with the accumulated power of previous users. Her distaff, used for spinning thread, doubled as a magical tool for weaving fate and destiny. She carried pouches of herbs, stones, and other materials that served both magical and medicinal purposes, because in the medieval world, the boundary between medicine and magic was more suggestion than hard line. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the elaborate grave goods buried with Velvas, confirming their high status and providing insight into their practices. The Firkat Velva, discovered in Denmark, was buried with a remarkable collection of objects, including silver amulets, healing herbs, and what appears to be a complete magical toolkit. Her grave goods suggest a woman of considerable wealth and importance who was honored in death as she had been respected in life. Similar burials across Scandinavia tell the same story. These were women whose spiritual authority translated into real social and economic power. The knowledge base required for cider practice was encyclopedic and constantly expanding. Velvas needed to understand astronomy, herbal medicine, psychology, weather patterns, genealogy, law, and the complex mythological system that provided the framework for their magical practices. They memorized vast amounts of information about gods, spirits, magical procedures, and the intricate web of relationships that connected the human and divine worlds. This knowledge was primarily transmitted orally, creating an educational system that produced women whose learning rivaled that of the most educated monks in medieval Europe. The healing practices associated with cider magic demonstrate the practical applications of spiritual authority. Velva served as physicians, psychologists, and midwives for communities that often lacked access to other medical care. They treated everything from broken bones to mysterious illnesses to psychological disorders that modern medicine would recognize as depression, anxiety, or PTSD. Their healing methods combined herbal medicine, psychological counseling, and spiritual intervention in ways that addressed both physical symptoms and underlying spiritual or emotional causes. The Velva's relationship with death and the afterlife gave her unique authority in matters of mourning, inheritance, and family disputes. She could communicate with the spirits of the dead, providing closure for grieving families and resolving conflicts that arose from unclear final wishes or disputed inheritances. She conducted funeral rites, blessed burial sites, and offered comfort to those struggling with loss. In a warrior culture where violent death was common and life expectancy was short, these services were not luxuries but essential support for communities dealing with constant trauma and loss. The training of new Velvas involved a complex apprenticeship system that could last for years or even decades. Young women who showed aptitude for trance states, demonstrated unusual sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, or displayed natural healing abilities might be taken on as students by established practitioners. The training involved learning not just magical techniques, but the social skills necessary to navigate the complex political and personal relationships that defined a Velva's working life. Students learned to read people, manage dangerous situations, and maintain the delicate balance between providing honest counsel and staying alive when that counsel proved unwelcome. The seasonal cycles that governed agricultural and maritime activities also shaped the Velva's working year. Spring brought requests for blessings on new endeavors. Summer required healing services for injuries and illnesses that flourished in warm weather. Autumn was the time for divination about winter survival and the success of harvest preservation efforts. And winter brought the most serious spiritual work as communities huddled together and confronted their deepest fears about mortality, scarcity, and the return of light. The international connections, maintained by Velvas, created networks of spiritual authority that spanned the Viking world. A Velva trained in Iceland might practice in Dublin, Kiev, or Constantinople, carrying with her not just magical techniques, but cultural knowledge and political intelligence that proved valuable to local communities. These spiritual networks facilitated cultural exchange, preserved traditional knowledge, and provided stability in regions where political control changed frequently and violently. The relationship between Velvas and male religious practitioners was complex and sometimes competitive. While Seder was predominantly associated with women, some men also practiced it, though they often faced social stigma for engaging in what was considered inherently feminine magic. The god Odin himself was said to practice Seder, having learned it from the goddess Freya, which provided divine precedent for male practitioners, but also reinforced the association between this type of magic and feminine spiritual authority. The Velva's role in legal and political disputes extended beyond simple prophecy to active mediation and conflict resolution. Her spiritual authority gave her the standing to intervene in feuds, negotiate settlements, and propose solutions that might be accepted by parties who wouldn't listen to purely secular mediators. She could invoke divine sanction for agreements, threaten spiritual consequences for oath-breaking, and provide face-saving explanations for backing down from conflicts that had escalated beyond rational resolution. The economic impact of Velva services on local communities was substantial and multifaceted. Direct payments for consultations and ceremonies brought wealth into communities that might otherwise have little access to precious metals or luxury goods. The Velva's presence attracted visitors from neighboring areas, creating opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. Her services could prevent costly mistakes, reduce community conflicts that disrupted economic activity, and provide the confidence necessary for risky but potentially profitable ventures. The Christianization of Scandinavia posed an existential threat to the Velva tradition, as the new religion had no place for female spiritual authority and actively condemned magical practices as demonic. The transition period was marked by attempts to suppress Seder practice, persecute Velvas, and replace indigenous spiritual traditions with imported Christian practices. Some Velvas adapted by incorporating Christian elements into their practice, while others retreated to remote areas where traditional beliefs persisted longer. The destruction of the Velva tradition represented not just religious change, but the loss of a unique form of female empowerment that had no equivalent in medieval European society. The literary preservation of Velva traditions in the sagas provides detailed accounts of their practices and influence, though these sources must be interpreted carefully, since they were written down after Christianization by authors who may have had complex motivations for preserving or distorting pagan traditions. The Voluspa, one of the most important poems in the Poetic Edda, is presented as the prophecy of a Velva who reveals the history and fate of the gods and the world. The poem's cosmic scope and authoritative voice reflect the high status accorded to female spiritual authority in Norse culture. The archaeological evidence for Velva practices continues to expand as new discoveries provide insight into the material culture of Norse magic and religion. Excavations at ritual sites reveal the physical settings where ceremonies took place, while grave goods provide information about the tools and symbols associated with spiritual practice. Laboratory analysis of organic remains has identified specific herbs and substances used in magical and medicinal practices, confirming and expanding our understanding of Velva knowledge and techniques. If you think modern professional women face challenges balancing authority and social expectations, imagine trying to maintain credibility as a spiritual advisor while your male clients secretly wondered whether your menstrual cycle affected the accuracy of your prophecies. The Velva navigated a world where her gender was simultaneously the source of her spiritual power and a potential weakness that enemies could exploit. She wielded authority that kings respected and warriors feared, but she did so in a social context that remained fundamentally patriarchal, despite its unusual openness to female spiritual leadership. The Velva tradition represents one of the most remarkable examples of female empowerment in medieval Europe, a spiritual role that provided women with authority, independence, and influence that had no equivalent in Christian society. These women didn't just practice magic, they shaped the political, social, and economic life of their communities through their spiritual authority. They were the trusted advisors to kings, the healers of bodies and souls, the mediators of conflicts, and the keepers of knowledge that sustained Norse culture for centuries. When the last Velva put down her staff and ceased her wandering, the medieval world lost not just a religious tradition but a unique model of female authority that wouldn't be seen again until modernity grudgingly acknowledged that women might occasionally have something useful to contribute to matters of importance. If you think modern dating is complicated, imagine explaining to a medieval European nobleman that your prospective Viking bride-to-be has just informed you she'll only marry you if you agree to let her keep her own name, her own property, her own business interests, and the absolute right to divorce you if you fail to meet her clearly stated expectations regarding household management, social conduct, and marital performance. Oh, and she's also mentioned that her father's approval is nice, but ultimately irrelevant, since she'll be making this decision herself. Thank you very much. In most of medieval Europe, such a conversation would have ended with the nobleman checking his calendar to see when the next witch burning was scheduled. But in Viking society, it was the opening round of what passed for normal courtship negotiations, a process that treated marriage less like a property transfer and more like a business merger between two independent parties who happened to find each other attractive enough to risk sharing living space, livestock, and the inevitable arguments over whose turn it was to empty the chamber pot. While marriages across the rest of medieval Europe were being arranged like real estate transactions, with women serving as valuable but ultimately passive assets to be traded between families for political advantage, Viking marriages operated on principles that would have seemed dangerously progressive to observers from more civilized parts of the continent. The idea that a woman might have opinions about her choice of husband, let alone the audacity to express those opinions and expect them to be respected, challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, authority, and the natural order that underpinned medieval European society. The courtship process in Viking society began with the revolutionary premise that both parties should consent to the marriage. This wasn't the grudging acceptance that passed for female consent elsewhere in Europe, where a woman's failure to actively resist her father's choice was considered enthusiastic endorsement. Viking women were expected to express genuine approval of their prospective husbands, and this approval couldn't be coerced, purchased, or assumed. A woman who objected to a proposed match could refuse it outright, and her refusal was legally binding regardless of her father's preferences or the economic advantages the marriage might bring to her family. The practical mechanics of Viking courtship involved a complex dance of negotiation between multiple interested parties. The prospective groom had to win not just the woman's consent, but also demonstrate his ability to provide for her and any future children. This wasn't just about financial resources. It included character assessment, social standing evaluation, and what modern people might recognize as compatibility testing. The woman and her family investigated the suitor's reputation, examined his property and prospects, and made careful inquiries about his treatment of previous wives, because divorce was common enough that many potential husbands came with references, both positive and negative. The betrothal process itself was a formal affair that involved detailed negotiations about property, inheritance rights, and the terms of the marriage contract. These weren't simple ceremonies where fathers shook hands and transferred ownership of daughters. They were complex legal proceedings that required careful attention to the interests of both spouses. The bride's family negotiated for guarantees about her treatment, her property rights, and her freedom to maintain connections with her birth family. The groom's family sought assurances about dowry payments, inheritance arrangements, and the bride's commitment to supporting their son's career and social ambitions. The wedding ceremony, when it finally occurred, was less about religious blessing and more about public witness to a contract between equals. The bride wasn't given away by her father. She entered the marriage as an independent party to a negotiated agreement. The ceremony included the symbolic exchange of weapons. The groom gave the bride a sword, which she would pass to their future son, while she gave him family heirlooms that represented her acceptance of responsibility for his lineage. It was a ritual that emphasized mutual obligation and shared responsibility rather than the subordination of one party to another. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Viking marriage, from a medieval European perspective, was how easily it could be dissolved. While Christian marriage was becoming increasingly defined as an indissoluble sacrament that bound couples together until death, regardless of circumstances, Viking marriage was treated as a practical arrangement that could be terminated if it ceased to serve the interests of either party. The grounds for divorce were refreshingly comprehensive and surprisingly equitable, covering everything from serious misconduct to simple incompatibility. A Viking woman could initiate divorce proceedings for reasons that would have seemed trivial to her European contemporaries, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of what made marriages functional and sustainable. Financial incompetence was grounds for divorce. Your husband consistently made poor economic decisions that threatened the household's prosperity. You could end the marriage and protect your assets. Physical violence was obviously cause for divorce, but so was emotional abuse, public humiliation, and failure to maintain the family's social standing within the community. Sexual incompetence was also legitimate grounds for divorce, and the legal codes were remarkably specific about what constituted adequate marital performance. A husband who failed to satisfy his wife's physical needs, who proved incapable of fathering children, or who demonstrated what the law diplomatically termed unnatural preferences, could find himself divorced faster than he could explain his shortcomings. The legal system approached marital sexuality with a frankness that would have horrified Christian theologians, treating sexual compatibility as a practical matter that affected the success of the partnership rather than a sinful distraction from spiritual concerns. Perhaps most remarkably, irreconcilable differences, what modern people might call growing apart, was considered sufficient cause for divorce. if a couple simply discovered they couldn't live together harmoniously, if their personalities clashed in ways that made household peace impossible, or if they developed incompatible goals and ambitions, either party could initiate divorce proceedings. The legal system didn't require evidence of wrongdoing, moral failure, or criminal behavior. It simply recognized that some marriages didn't work, and that forcing incompatible people to remain together served no useful purpose. The divorce process itself was remarkably streamlined compared to the complex ecclesiastical procedures required elsewhere in Europe. A Viking woman, seeking divorce, simply declared her intentions before witnesses, specified her grounds, and initiated property division proceedings. There were no lengthy court battles, no requirements for papal approval, and no need to prove moral superiority or victimhood. The community's role was to ensure fair distribution of assets and reasonable arrangements for any children, not to question whether divorce was morally appropriate or socially acceptable. The property implications of Viking divorce were particularly favorable to women and reflected the sophisticated understanding of marriage as an economic partnership between independent actors. A divorced woman retained her personal property. Everything she had brought to the marriage remained hers. She also received a share of jointly acquired assets that reflected her contributions to the household's prosperity during the marriage. This wasn't charity or alimony, it was recognition that she had been an equal partner in creating the family's wealth and deserved compensation for her investment of time, labor, and resources. The custody arrangements that followed Viking divorces were similarly practical and equitable. Children typically remained with the parent best equipped to care for them, which often meant staying with their mother, who was likely to maintain the household and its economic operations. But custody wasn't automatically awarded based on gender. It was determined by practical considerations, including financial resources, family support networks, and the children's own preferences, if they were old enough to express them. A successful businesswoman might retain custody of all her children, while a woman without adequate resources might place some children with their father or his relatives, while keeping others with her. The social consequences of divorce were minimal compared to the ostracism faced by divorced women in other parts of medieval Europe. A divorced Viking woman wasn't a social pariah or a moral failure. She was simply someone whose first marriage hadn't worked out as planned. She could remarry without difficulty, often to men who valued her experience and proven ability to manage household affairs. In fact, divorced women were sometimes considered more desirable marriage partners than young unmarried women, since they had demonstrated their competence in domestic management and their ability to bear children. The remarriage patterns of divorced Viking women reveal a society that valued practical partnership over romantic idealism. Many women divorced one husband and married another within the same social season, suggesting that divorce was often a strategic decision rather than an emotional crisis. A woman might divorce a husband whose business ventures had failed and marry a more successful merchant, or she might leave a husband whose family connections had proven disappointing and marry into a clan with better political prospects. These weren't necessarily cold, calculating decisions. They were practical choices made by women who understood that marriage was both a personal relationship and an economic alliance. The legal framework that supported women's marital independence extended beyond divorce to include protection of married women's property rights and business interests. A Viking wife didn't lose her legal identity upon marriage. She remained an independent actor who could own property, enter contracts, and pursue business ventures without her husband's permission or oversight. This independence wasn't theoretical. Archaeological and documentary evidence reveals married women who owned their own trading operations, maintained separate financial accounts, and made investment decisions independently of their husband's business activities. The household dynamics that resulted from this legal equality were fundamentally different from those found in other medieval European societies. Viking marriages were partnerships between people who retained their individual identities, interests, and ambitions, rather than relationships where one party absorbed the other's legal and economic existence. Husbands and wives negotiated household decisions, shared responsibility for economic management, and maintained separate social networks and business relationships. It was marriage as collaborative enterprise rather than hierarchical domination. The economic implications of women's marital independence were profound and far-reaching. When married women could own property and operate businesses independently, they became significant economic actors whose decisions shaped markets and investment patterns. Viking women invested in trading expeditions, financed craft production, and participated in the complex networks of credit and debt that sustained commercial activity throughout the Norse world. Their economic activities weren't dependent on their husband's success or approval. They were independent entrepreneurs whose prosperity depended on their own skills and judgment. The child-rearing practices that emerged from this egalitarian approach to marriage emphasized independence and practical skills for both boys and girls. Viking children grew up observing marriages that functioned as partnerships between equals, learning that both men and women could be competent decision-makers, successful business operators, and effective household managers. Girls weren't raised solely to be wives and mothers. They were trained to be independent actors who could succeed with or without male support. Boys weren't taught that marriage gave them authority over women. They learned that successful marriages required negotiation, cooperation, and mutual respect. The cultural values that supported Viking women's marital independence were reinforced by religious beliefs that celebrated strong, independent female figures. The goddesses of Norse mythology weren't passive, subordinated figures who derived their value from relationships to male deities. They were powerful, autonomous beings who commanded respect in their own right. Frigg ruled her own domain, Freya chose her own lovers, and the Valkyries determined which warriors would die in battle. These divine role models provided cultural support for human women who sought to maintain their independence and authority within marriage. The international scope of Viking marriage customs meant that these egalitarian practices spread throughout the territories where Vikings settled or traded. A Viking woman living in Dublin, York, or Kiev could expect her marital rights to be recognized and protected by legal frameworks that transcended national boundaries. This legal portability was crucial for a society whose members regularly traveled vast distances for trade, exploration, and settlement. It also meant that Viking marriage customs influenced local practices in regions where Vikings established permanent communities. The seasonal rhythms of Viking life created unique pressures and opportunities within marriages. The long winter months, when families were confined together in crowded longhouses, tested the compatibility and patience of even the most harmonious couples. Marriages that couldn't withstand the stress of extended close proximity often ended in spring divorce proceedings, when travel became possible again and new living arrangements could be established. Conversely, couples who survived winter isolation together often emerged with stronger partnerships and deeper mutual respect. The role of extended family networks in supporting marital independence was crucial to the system's success. Viking women maintained strong connections to their birth families throughout their lives, creating support networks that provided alternatives to unhappy marriages and resources for divorced women seeking to re-establish themselves. These family connections weren't just emotional support, they were practical alliances that provided economic opportunities, legal assistance, and social validation for women's independent choices. The documentation of Viking marriage practices comes from multiple sources that provide both legal frameworks and individual stories. The Icelandic sagas preserve detailed accounts of courtships, marriages, and divorces that reveal the practical operation of legal principles. Law codes specify procedures and rights with precision that confirms the systematic nature of women's marital protections. Archaeological evidence including runic inscriptions and burial practices, provides additional confirmation of women's status within marriage and family structures. The contrast between Viking marriage customs and contemporary European practices couldn't be more dramatic. While English law was developing the principle that husband and wife became one person and that person was legally the husband, Viking law treated marriage as a partnership between independent individuals who retained their separate legal identities, while continental European marriage customs emphasized the transfer of women from their father's authority to their husband's control. Viking customs assumed women's capacity for independent decision-making and self-determination. The training and socialization that prepared Viking women for independent marriage began early and continued throughout their lives. Young girls learned property management, business skills, and legal procedures by observing and participating in household operations. They developed the confidence and competence necessary to function as equal partners in marriage and to make independent decisions about their personal and professional lives. This education created women who approached marriage as informed participants rather than passive recipients of male decision-making. The legacy of Viking marriage customs extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing legal traditions in regions where Vikings settled and contributing to the gradual development of more egalitarian marriage laws. Some historians argue that Viking legal concepts helped lay the groundwork for later developments in women's rights, property law, and divorce procedures. The principle that marriage should be a partnership between equals rather than a relationship of dominance and submission can be traced through various legal traditions to the Thing assemblies where Viking couples negotiated their domestic arrangements. If you think modern prenuptial agreements are complicated, imagine negotiating a marriage contract that had to account for the possibility that your spouse might be killed in a raid, cursed by a Velva, or simply decide that your personality was incompatible with long-term domestic harmony. Viking marriage contracts were documents that attempted to predict and provide for every possible contingency in a world where life was uncertain, death was common, and divorce was always an option. They were legal instruments that reflected a society's understanding that successful marriages required more than romantic attraction. They needed practical planning, mutual respect, and the wisdom to know when cutting your losses was better than enduring misery for the sake of social convention. The Thing assemblies where marital disputes were resolved weren't just legal venues. They were theatres of human drama where private conflicts became public entertainment and personal failures were dissected with the thoroughness usually reserved for military strategy. A divorce proceeding might involve detailed testimony about everything from household management skills to sexual performance, delivered before an audience of neighbours who would spend the rest of the winter discussing the revelations. It was a legal system that combined practical problem-solving with community bonding through shared voyeurism, administered by people who understood that marriage wasn't just a private arrangement between two individuals. It was a social institution that affected the entire community's stability and prosperity. The ultimate irony of Viking marriage was that a society famous for violence, raiding, and warrior culture created domestic arrangements that were more egalitarian, more flexible, and more respectful of individual autonomy than anything found in the supposedly more civilized and Christian parts of medieval Europe. While priests elsewhere preached about marriage as a sacred bond that trapped couples in relationships regardless of abuse, incompetence, or simple human misery, Viking society quietly went about the business of treating marriage as what it actually was: a partnership between flawed human beings who deserved the right to make their own mistakes, learn from their own experiences, and pursue their own happiness with whatever combination of wisdom, stubbornness, and sheer bloody-minded determination they could muster. Picture this. You're watching a modern Viking movie, and there she is, the shield maiden, 6 feet tall, flawlessly braided, wielding a sword that's somehow both historically accurate and completely impractical, cutting through enemy warriors like a hot knife through butter. while maintaining perfect makeup and not so much as breathing hard. She's fierce, she's fearless, and she's about as historically accurate as a dragon-riding unicorn. Now imagine trying to explain to this Hollywood warrior goddess that the real Viking women, who occasionally picked up weapons, were more likely to be middle-aged farm wives, defending their homesteads with kitchen knives than glamorous professional soldiers engaging in choreographed battle sequences. The gap between legend and reality when it comes to Viking shield maidens is so vast, you could sail a longship through it, which is exactly what generations of storytellers, historians, and entertainment executives have done, creating a mythology so compelling that it's almost completely obscured the far more interesting truth about the real women who earned their place in Viking warrior culture. The Shield Maiden legend has its roots in genuine historical accounts, but like a game of medieval telephone played across centuries, the original facts have been embellished, romanticized, and occasionally invented outright, until they bear only passing resemblance to historical reality. The sagas speak of legendary warriors like Lagertha, Herva, and Thornbjörg, women who supposedly led armies, conquered kingdoms, and struck fear into the hearts of men from Ireland to Constantinople. These stories are thrilling, empowering, and almost certainly exaggerated beyond recognition. They're the medieval equivalent of action movies based on true events, but with the boring bits removed and the exciting parts enhanced until they become something entirely different. The archaeological record, thankfully, provides a more nuanced and ultimately more fascinating picture of Viking women's relationship with warfare and violence. In 2017, researchers re-examined one of the most famous Viking burials from Birka, Swedina grave that had been assumed for decades to contain a high-ranking male warrior because of the impressive collection of weapons and military equipment buried with the body. DNA analysis revealed that the occupant was actually a woman, buried with a sword, axe, spear, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 horses, along with a gaming board that suggested she was involved in military strategy and planning. It was a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community and provided concrete evidence that at least some Viking women were indeed warriors of considerable status and skill. But before we get too excited about vindicated Hollywood stereotypes, it's worth noting that the Birka warrior represents something quite different from the mythical Shield Maiden. She wasn't a young, beautiful warrior princess, fighting for glory and romance. The skeletal analysis suggests she was a mature woman, possibly in her 30s or 40s, who had lived a physically demanding life and achieved a position of considerable military authority. She was buried, not in some remote battlefield, but in a prosperous trading center, suggesting that her warrior status was part of a complex social and economic role, rather than a simple matter of swinging a sword and looking fierce while doing it. The Birka burial also raises fascinating questions about the nature of Viking warfare and the roles that women might have played in military operations. The gaming board found in her grave suggests involvement in strategy and planning rather than just frontline combat. She might have been a military commander, a logistical coordinator, or a specialist in siege warfare roles that required intelligence, experience, and leadership skills rather than just physical prowess. It's a reminder that medieval warfare was more than just berserkers charging into battle. It was a complex enterprise that required planning, coordination, and expertise in areas where women's skills and knowledge could prove invaluable. Other archaeological discoveries have provided additional evidence for female involvement in Viking warfare, though the picture that emerges is complex and sometimes contradictory. Female burials with weapons have been found across Scandinavia, but they're rare enough to suggest that armed women were exceptional rather than common. The weapons are often of high quality, suggesting that these women held positions of status and authority rather than serving as common foot soldiers. Some graves contain single weapons, a knife or spear, that might have been defensive tools rather than indicators of warrior status. Others contain full military equipment that clearly marks the deceased as a professional fighter. The sagas provide literary evidence for female warriors, but these sources must be interpreted carefully since they were written down centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian authors who had complex motivations for preserving or altering pagan traditions. The legendary Lagertha, described by Saxo Grammaticus as a Norwegian ruler who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, may have been based on a real historical figure, but the details of her story have been so embellished and mythologized that it's impossible to separate fact from fiction. She's described as ruling in her own right, leading armies into battle, and demonstrating strategic brilliance that impressed even her male contemporaries. But she's also credited with supernatural abilities and involved in plotlines that read more like fantasy literature than historical chronicle. The practical realities of Viking warfare provide important context for understanding women's potential roles as fighters. Viking combat was brutal, physical, and required not just courage, but substantial training, physical conditioning, and experience with weapons that were heavy, unwieldy, and designed for users with considerable upper body strength. A Viking sword weighed several pounds and required techniques that took years to master. Wielding one effectively in combat required muscle mass and training that few women would have possessed unless they had dedicated significant time and resources to military preparation. But Viking warfare wasn't just about individual combat prowess. It was also about group tactics, naval operations, and siege warfare that required diverse skills and expertise. Women might have served as archers, since archery required accuracy and technique rather than brute strength. They could have been involved in naval operations, since Viking women were skilled sailors and ship handlers. They might have specialized in siege warfare, which required engineering knowledge and logistical expertise rather than hand-to-hand combat skills. The idea that women warriors were necessarily inferior fighters misses the point that medieval warfare required many different types of expertise. The training required to become a competent Viking warrior began in childhood and continued throughout a fighter's career. Boys started learning weapon skills around age 7 or 8, spending years developing the muscle memory, reflexes, and tactical understanding necessary for survival in combat. For a woman to achieve similar competence, she would have needed access to training, weapons, and practice partners willing to treat her as a serious student rather than a curiosity. This suggests that female warriors came from families or communities that actively supported their military development, probably wealthy households that could afford to dedicate resources to unconventional pursuits. The social attitudes toward female warriors in Viking society were complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, Norse culture celebrated martial prowess regardless of gender, and the sagas contain numerous examples of women who were praised for their courage and fighting skills. The Valkyries, divine warrior maidens who chose which fighters would die in battle, provided mythological precedent for female involvement in warfare. On the other hand, Viking society was fundamentally patriarchal, and women who took up arms were stepping outside conventional gender roles in ways that probably generated both admiration and suspicion. The legal implications of women's warrior status were significant and reveal important aspects of Viking social structure. A woman who could fight effectively could defend her own honor, protect her property, and pursue vengeance for wrongs committed against her family. This independence was both empowering and potentially destabilizing, since it challenged traditional assumptions about male protection and female vulnerability. The legal codes provide evidence that armed women were recognized as legitimate participants in the complex systems of honor, revenge, and compensation that governed Viking society. The economic factors that influenced women's participation in warfare were equally complex. Professional warriors required expensive equipment, ongoing training, and the financial support necessary to maintain a lifestyle that prioritized military readiness over productive labor. Few Viking families could afford to support non-productive members, which suggests that female warriors either came from wealthy backgrounds or found ways to make their military skills economically valuable. Some might have served as bodyguards for wealthy individuals, others might have led raiding expeditions, and still others might have combined warrior status with other roles that generated income. The religious dimensions of female warfare in Viking culture reflect the complex relationship between Norse paganism and gender roles. The goddess Freya was associated with both love and war, demonstrating that Viking religion recognized the compatibility of femininity and martial prowess. The Valkyries served Odin by selecting slain warriors for Valhalla, wielding divine authority over life and death in military contexts. These religious frameworks provided cultural support for women who chose to take up arms, though they also created expectations about how female warriors should behave and what roles they should play. The international context of Viking expansion created opportunities for women warriors that might not have existed in more settled societies. The Viking diaspora established communities from Iceland to Constantinople, creating demand for leaders, fighters, and settlers who could adapt to diverse environments and circumstances. A woman with military skills might find opportunities in these frontier communities that wouldn't have been available in established Scandinavian settlements. The fluidity and adaptability that characterized Viking expansion probably created space for unconventional gender roles that challenged traditional expectations. The seasonal rhythms of Viking warfare also influenced women's participation in military activities. The sailing season, roughly from spring to autumn, was when most raids and military expeditions took place. During winter, when communities were confined to their settlements, women might have had time to train with weapons, study tactics, and prepare for the next campaigning season. The long winter months also provided opportunities for storytelling and the transmission of martial knowledge that might have included female-oriented perspectives on warfare and strategy. The material culture associated with Viking women warriors reveals important details about their equipment, status, and fighting methods. The weapons found in female graves are often of exceptional quality, suggesting that these women had access to the best available equipment rather than making do with inferior tools. Some graves contain specialized weapons, particular types of spears or arrows that might indicate expertise in specific fighting techniques. The presence of gaming boards and other strategic implements suggests that female warriors were involved in planning and command rather than just fighting. The preservation of shield maiden traditions in later Scandinavian folklore demonstrates the lasting impact of female warriors on cultural memory, even if the historical reality was more limited than the legends suggest. Medieval ballads, folktales, and historical chronicles continued to celebrate female fighters centuries after the Viking Age ended, suggesting that these figures had captured the popular imagination in ways that transcended their actual historical significance. The legends grew and evolved over time, incorporating elements from other cultures and periods, until they became the romanticized shield maidens of modern popular culture. The comparative context of female warriors in other medieval cultures provides useful perspective on the Viking experience. Celtic cultures had their own traditions of female fighters, from the legendary Queen Boudica to the warrior women described in Irish mythology. Byzantine sources describe female combatants among various barbarian tribes. The Rus, Viking settlers in Eastern Europe, apparently included women in their military expeditions, according to Arab chroniclers who encountered them. These cross-cultural examples suggest that Viking shield maidens were part of a broader pattern of female military participation that was more common in medieval Europe than traditional histories have acknowledged. The decline of female warrior traditions during the Christianization of Scandinavia reflects broader changes in gender roles and social expectations that accompanied religious conversion. Christian ideology emphasized female subordination and domesticity in ways that were incompatible with independent female warriors. The new religion provided no equivalent to the Valkyries or warrior goddesses that had legitimized female involvement in warfare. As Viking society became more settled and hierarchical, opportunities for women to achieve status through military prowess probably diminished, channeling female ambitions toward the religious, domestic, and commercial spheres where Christian society was more willing to accept female expertise. The modern revival of interest in shield maidens reflects contemporary concerns about gender equality and female empowerment rather than purely historical curiosity. The image of the strong, independent female warrior appeals to modern audiences seeking alternatives to traditional gender stereotypes, creating demand for shield maiden stories that emphasize empowerment over historical accuracy. This modern mythology serves important cultural functions, but it shouldn't be confused with serious historical analysis of Viking women's actual experiences and achievements. The archaeological techniques that revealed the true sex of the Birka warrior demonstrate how modern scientific methods are revolutionizing our understanding of the past. DNA analysis, isotope studies, and other forensic techniques are providing new insights into Viking society that challenge long-held assumptions about gender, status, and social organization. As these methods are applied to other burials and archaeological sites, we can expect additional discoveries that will complicate and enrich our understanding of Viking women's roles in warfare and society. The documentary evidence for Viking women warriors comes primarily from later sources that must be interpreted carefully, but some contemporary accounts provide valuable insights. Byzantine sources describe encounters with Viking forces that included women, though it's often unclear whether these women were combatants, camp followers, or participants in non-military capacities. Arab chroniclers occasionally mention female fighters among the Rus, though their accounts are filtered through cultural assumptions that may have distorted their observations. These sources provide tantalizing glimpses of historical reality, but they're insufficient to support definitive conclusions about the prevalence or significance of female warriors in Viking society. The training and socialization that prepared some Viking women for warrior roles probably began early and required family support that was exceptional rather than typical. A girl who showed aptitude for fighting would have needed access to weapons, instruction from experienced fighters, and practice opportunities that were probably expensive and time-consuming. The fact that some women achieved warrior status suggests that Viking society was flexible enough to accommodate unconventional gender roles, but the rarity of female warriors indicates that these opportunities were limited and probably concentrated among wealthy or influential families. The psychological factors that motivated Viking women to become warriors were probably as complex and individual as those that drive modern women to enter male-dominated professions. Some might have been motivated by personal ambition, others by family circumstances that required them to defend property or honor. Some might have been driven by religious conviction or cultural ideals that celebrated martial prowess. Others might have simply possessed natural talents for fighting that they were encouraged to develop. The diversity of motivations probably created equally diverse types of female warriors, with different roles, specializations, and levels of involvement in military activities. If you think modern discussions about women in combat roles are complicated, imagine trying to explain to a Viking warband why their new recruit was a 40-something farmer's wife who could split your skull with an axe, but insisted on finishing the harvest before joining any raids. The reality of Viking women warriors was far more pragmatic and far less glamorous than the leather-clad fantasy figures of popular culture, but it was also more interesting because it reflected real human struggles with identity, opportunity, and the eternal question of whether personal fulfillment was worth defying social expectations and risking everything on the battlefield. The Shield Maiden legend will probably continue to evolve, shaped by contemporary values and concerns rather than historical evidence, because the image of the female warrior serves psychological and cultural needs that transcend mere historical accuracy. But the real Viking women, who occasionally picked up weapons whether they were defending their homes, leading raids, or carving out new roles in a society that was just flexible enough to let them try, deserve recognition for their actual achievements rather than their mythological representations. They weren't superhuman fantasy figures. They were human beings who made extraordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances, creating possibilities that wouldn't be seen again until modernity grudgingly acknowledged that women might occasionally have something useful to contribute to the traditionally male sphere of organized violence. The ultimate irony of the Shield Maiden phenomenon is that the mythological version has become so compelling that it's obscured the more remarkable truth. Viking society was unusual not because it produced large numbers of female warriors, but because it was flexible enough to allow exceptional women to transcend conventional gender roles when they had the motivation, opportunity, and support necessary to do so. That flexibility, that willingness to value competence over convention and results over tradition, was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Viking culture and the one that modern societies are still struggling to fully embrace.